Travel along, Catholic pilgrims, as we learn from St. Augustine, Doctor of the Church, while we read his book, Confessions. Hello, Catholic pilgrims, welcome. Today we hear the name of two friends of St. Augustine, Alypius and Nebridius. We will mostly hear about Alypius and how he became someone that St. Augustine wanted to rescue from a life of frivolous pursuits. Let's hear about Alypius in Book 6, Chapter 7, on page 120. This was a constant subject of gloomy talk among my circle of friends, but I used to discuss it especially with Alypius and Nebridius. Alypius came from my own town, and his people were one of the leading families. He was younger than I was and had been a student of mine both in our own town when I first began to teach and later on at Carthage. He was greatly attached to me because he thought that I was a good and learned man, and I was fond of him because, although he was still young, it was quite clear that he had much natural disposition to goodness. But he had been caught in the whirl of easy morals at Carthage, with its continual round of futile entertainments, and had lost his heart and his head to the games in the amphitheater. At the time when he was so wrapped up in this wretched sport, I had opened my school as professor of rhetoric in Carthage, but because of some difference of opinion which had occurred between his father and me, he was not one of my pupils. I found out that he was fatally attracted by the games, and it caused me grave anxiety to think that he was likely to ruin a future which promised so well, if he had not already done so. But I had no means of offering him advice or using any pressure to restrain him, for I could claim neither the privilege of a friend nor the right of a master. I thought that he shared his father's feelings about me, although, in fact, this was not the case, for he ignored his father's wishes and treated me with courtesy when we met. He soon began to come and listen to some of my lectures, but he never stayed for long. I had forgotten that I might use my influence with him to prevent him from wasting his talents in this thoughtless, impetuous enthusiasm for futile pastimes. But you, O Lord, who hold the reins of all you have created, had not forgotten this man who was one day to be a bishop and administer your sacrament to your children. You used me to set him on the right path, but so that we might recognize that it was all by your doing, you used me without my knowledge. One day, as I sat in my usual place with my students before me, Alypius came in and, after greeting me politely, sat down and listened attentively to the lesson. It occurred to me that the passage which I happened to be reading could very well be explained by an illustration taken from the games in the arena. It would appeal to the students and make my meaning clearer, and it would also enable me to make a laughing stock of those who were under the spell of this insane sport. You know, my God, that I was not thinking of Alypius, who so badly needed to be cured of this mania. But he took my words to heart, thinking that I had meant the allusion to apply to him alone. Anyone else would have taken this as a good reason to be angry with me, but this conscientious young man saw in it cause for anger with himself and warmer affection for me. Long ago you caused these words of yours to be inserted in your book. The wise are grateful for a remonstrance. I had not meant to rebuke him, but you use us all, whether we know it or not, for a purpose which is known to you, a purpose which is just. You made my heart and my tongue burn like coals to sear his mind, which was so full of promise, and cure it when it was sick of a wasting disease. Those who have no inkling of your mercy may be silent and offer you no word of praise, but from the depths of my heart I make a vow of your mercy. For after he had heard my words, Alypius hastened to drag himself out of the deep pitfall into which, dazzled by the allure of pleasure, he had plunged of his own accord. By a great effort of self-control, he shook himself free of all the dirt of the arena and never went near it again. Then he managed to overcome his father's reluctance to allow him to become a pupil of mine. His father gave in and granted his request. But once he had started his studies with me, he became involved in my superstitious beliefs. He particularly admired the Manichees for their ostensible continence, which he thought quite genuine, though of course it was merely a nonsensical and deceitful method of trapping precious souls, which had not learnt to feel the depth of real virtue and were easily deceived by the appearance of virtue that was spurious and counterfeit. There are two words at the end of this reading that I want to focus on: ostensible countenance. Now, what St. Augustine meant by this phrase was an outwardly surface level visual display of self-control. We read at the end, quote, he, Alypius, particularly admired the Manichees for their ostensible countenance, which he thought quite genuine, though, of course, it was merely a nonsensical and deceitful method of trapping precious souls, which had not learnt to feel the depth of real virtue and were easily deceived by the appearance of virtue that was spurious and counterfeit. Unquote. Now, let me give you an example of what he's talking about. Many years ago, I was talking with this lady, and she was telling me and a crowd of other people that she had finished a marathon. Now, as an ex-sprinter, long-distance runners always impress me because I hate running anything past a mile. Upon hearing that she had completed a marathon, everyone had questions. How long did you train? Was it hard? What mile did you feel like giving up? All this. Well, she wasn't completely answering the questions. My husband has run a marathon, and he's been asked similar questions, and he always has answers. How long did you train? It took me months and months. Was it hard? Yes, especially because he got injured while he was running. What mile did you feel like giving up? Well, kind of after he got injured, which is kind of a funny story, but I don't have time for that right now. But the point is, my husband had answers to these questions. This lady, though, was being cagey, and so my spidey senses started to tingle. Everyone else was super impressed with her, and the admiration was flowing. But a little later on in the day, I discovered that she didn't run a marathon. She walked it. Now, don't get me wrong. Walking that far is a feat, but it's not the same as running the marathon. And the amount of dedication and self-discipline you need to run a marathon is not even close to the same. I could go out and walk 26.2 miles today. It might not be super fun, and I'd probably be hurting at the end, but I could do it. I most definitely could not run it without months and months of training. She was leading the crowd to believe that she had ran the whole thing, and it was deceptive. And that's why she was being so cagey. She knew that telling us that she had walked a marathon was not the same as saying that you ran a marathon. The crowd was impressed with her perceived ostensible continence, the outward surface level display of the self-control and discipline it would take to run a marathon. But it wasn't quite true. Now, St. Augustine is writing this looking back on what happened, so we get a different picture of what he thinks about the Manichees as opposed to how he felt about them when he was still one. And because St. Augustine had been a Manichee, and he knows later on in life that much of their practices were just for show or to make themselves feel good about themselves, he also knows it's all fake and counterfeit, but the ostensible countenance gains them admiration and imitation. St. Augustine didn't want Alypius to fall into that trap, even though we read here today that he starts to fall into the Manichean trap because of this outward display that he finds very real. So what does this mean for us? Well, it means that we need to be truthful and humble about our Catholic practices. Truthful and humble about everything, but specifically when talking about religion. And we need, for the most part, to just keep that interiorly. Unless someone asks you or you're trying to teach or explain, There is just no need to announce what you do as your spiritual practices in order to look like you are a good Catholic. So it's just something that we need to keep in mind. Outsiders are watching us, and we want them to come to the faith because we've been truthful, because we have a humble heart, and because we've expressed the truth of the gospel to them in such a way that they know it to be true, not because we've put on airs, as they say, and made the faith seem very appealing. That can be why somebody comes to the faith, seeing us practice our faith, that we need to make sure that we are doing it in a genuine, authentic, and humble way. That is all for today, Catholic Pilgrims. Meet me back here tomorrow, and until then, live the faith boldly and travel well.